Thanks for tuning in. My name is Steph Van Dalen, and I'm LATRO's Marketing Communications Manager. I'm really excited to share this content with you today. At the table, you'll see Don Reinhart, our Chief Operating Officer and Technology Officer, and Lex Wilkinson, our CEO, sit down together and talk through LATRO's history, how our company has evolved over the past 10 years, and our recent move into revenue assurance. So I hope you enjoy the content, and I'll see you when we're finished.
Action. So Don, how are you?
Lex, great to sit down and talk with you.
My pleasure.
We've been working at LATRO now together for almost 10 years, I think, and have been pretty successful with geolocation projects, focusing on SymBox. I think it's interesting how what we're doing today is really not that different than what you were doing way before LATRO.
A long time ago.
So tell us about some of your early experiences when you were working on some of the CTIA fraud contracts.
Sure, I'd love to. 1990, I left the police department and with two other gentlemen formed a company, the Guidry Group, and we lobbied to the CTIA to create a fraud task force. We thought that fraud was not a customer problem as much as an industry problem, and they agreed with us, and they levied created a $5 million fraud task force contract where we gathered intelligence, conducted investigations, and provided training for both cellular employees and law enforcement. So we started doing that. It was very successful. Probably 2-3 years later, I left that company. We started another company doing the same thing, had the same contracts.
So what were the primary fraud types occurring at that time? How are the operators losing money?
Well, the same way they are today, pretty much.
Yeah.
Subscription fraud, technical fraud, and internal fraud. I mean, those were the three primary.
Sounds familiar.
Nothing's changed. The way they do it has changed, but the types of fraud are the same.
So our teams today are going primarily outside the U.S. and international markets, and they're using specialized equipment to pinpoint and locate these illegal SIM gateway devices. So you did a version of that previously, right? This isn't a new concept.
No, not at all. And early 90s, the first fraud device was called a tumbler phone, which was basically a Mitsubishi 800 3-watt handheld, hang it up kind of phone. That would change a number. Either the ESN or the MIN would change by one number. It was all post-call validation. So the first call would go through with every ESN-MIN combination. Shortly after that, a guy named Richard Timson invented a program that allowed you to copy or clone one cellular phone and add that information to a second phone, called cloning. Cloning in the early 90s cost the industry over $1 billion.
$1 billion.
$1 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, the first year it came out, it was 500 million. So over the length of time, the exposure was probably close to $1 billion.
And this was analog cellular?
Analog was, yes, analog cellular. Mm-hmm. Analog was the first juiciest, easiest way to commit the fraud. The industry thought that when we moved to a digital environment that fraud would go away, but basically, as you alluded to earlier, subscription fraud was always there, and that just took over. Identity fraud. And we're talking early 90s, so this is a long time ago. And then cloning became such a problem that we did training, expanded all over the world, but from a technical perspective, as you said, we would use tracking equipment, tracking signal strength.
So you're actually going in and pinpointing the location, and then the police come in and arrest these guys?
Exactly. Well, again, this was more domestic U.S. activity, and because we had been involved in training all the federal, state, and local law enforcement that were dealing with this stuff in the country, we had relationships with all of them. So if we would get a case where there was a cloning operation, we'd buy phones undercover, or we'd track the data and go to the law enforcement guys and give them the facts, basically an affidavit of what we found or what we saw, and they would go get a search warrant and find it.
Right. Yeah, so it's crazy how conceptually it's almost the same process that we follow today. Our teams, like I said, have been highly successful in lots of different countries, including even high-risk areas. And I know the field engineers have a lot of interesting stories. What are some of your interesting stories from your past?
Well, when we talk about how complicated things are today, I'll go backwards to the utmost simplistic tracking was with a Curtis ESN reader that I put inside of a pizza box and cut a top on the pizza box so I could see the readings, and walk up and down the hallway of a hotel, putting the pizza box at each door until I found the one with the strongest signal, and that's the door we kicked in. So yeah, crazy how really the times have moved on, but in theory and in concept, a lot of the problems are still the same. Absolutely. So later in your career, you transitioned more from the law enforcement kind of investigation side to the carrier operator side. You joined Rural Cellular, and as I understand it, one of your large initiatives was instituting a revenue assurance function within their organization. Can you share with us why that happened and what were some of the thoughts behind it? Well, revenue assurance was a concept that we had been providing service to the industry for probably 6 or 7 years at that point, all over the world, through that company, Guidry and Walters Wilkinson. So we had done revenue assurance assessments, and when Rural hired me, it was to basically do roaming, fraud, and security, but they had no fraud or security program other than the initial cloning detection software. As in any business, as it matures, the focus moves towards bottom line profitability as opposed to just great sales. And when we had an initiative, an EBITDA target that would need for finding some lost dollars. And because I had that revenue assurance background, I was asked to create a revenue assurance program within Rural to try to capture an extra $1 million or $2 million. So that was a monthly, quarterly? What kind of scale are we talking about in terms of those targets? Those for the year, $1 million, and we found it in the first month. Yeah, crazy. So it was initiative. Revenue assurance is basically making sure your business is running the way it's supposed to be, avoiding leakage, discovering leakage, plugging leakage. That's at a high level, that's the concept. Yeah, where was the most common source of leakage back in the early days? Switch to billing reconciliation. So it's activities generated on the switch that don't have a corresponding billable activity in the billing system. Correct. Yep. And that's going on today as well. So larger number of services being provided by the operators, data, value-added services, not just voice, but it's amazing that we're still solving these problems in the industry today. And a much more complex downstream technology that we didn't have that many. We had a switch and a mediation device, and just tying those two together found a lot of money. So now you've got SGSN, GGSN, downstream technology that has more. So do you remember at its peak how many subscribers Rural had? What kind of numbers are we talking about? geez, I think we were at 750,000.
So less than 1 million.
Yeah.
Less than 1 million. And so we're talking about data sets that today you can probably do in Excel, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. What were some of the tools you used when you instituted the revenue assurance function within rural?
We went old school. We didn't have
Graph paper and ruler.
we didn't use graph paper as much as we use yellow legal pads, and basically requesting reports. The reports that you need to do revenue assurance are regular reports or standard reports that come off of each piece of equipment. So you just have to compare the numbers from one to the other, and that's what we did. We created manual processes. We looked at commissions. That's another, huge area. Did we charge back for subscription fraud? Because typically, our agents and dealers will create fraudulent accounts to gain commission, and if the company finds out that they're fraud 3 months down the road, if they don't charge back the commission, the agent or dealer gets to keep the money. And we were able to implement programs that stopped that, identified that, reduced that fraud quite a bit.
Right. So then eventually rural was acquired by Verizon, and you and the team were absorbed into the Verizon organization. This would have been in the early to mid 90s?
No, 2008.
Okay, sorry, yeah, early to mid 2000s. So how did the revenue assurance function change from your viewpoint, going from smaller rural operator to a larger tier 1 operator?
Well, Verizon was first and foremost is just a wonderful company with tremendous executive level buy-in on revenue assurance. They felt that way from the first meeting we ever had. So the fact that I had championed revenue assurance at rural, coupled with the GSM roaming and the impact of roaming fraud on the marketplace, and the fact that Verizon had no GSM activity at that time, they were a CDMA company, we were able to transition both people and process into Verizon that they found very attractive.
Mm-hmm. So as you've looked at our revenue assurance strategy today, what do you see as some of the similarities between, let's say, 10 years ago, what Verizon started doing and where we're headed today?
Verizon used revenue assurance in a more aggressive way than was considered typical. Verizon actually uses revenue assurance to pre-check billing plans before they ever roll out, to make sure that they're billing for every component of a transaction, and that was the outcome of our collaborative
Mm-hmm.
effort.
And I think even today, so I can see how forward looking that was back 10 years ago. When we look at the maturity model that's been defined and established within the industry through TM Forum, RAG, other industry associations, that proactive approach to what some people call business assurance now, as opposed to revenue assurance, is still an indicator of a mature function within the organization. So it's interesting that Verizon seemed to be at the forefront of that thinking more than 10 years ago.
Well, it's funny that you say business assurance, because we called it business assurance. Secondly, there's been cycles through the whole time, but business assurance was pretty cool for a while, and then it went back to revenue assurance, and apparently now business assurance is back. So that's neat.
Yeah, I think organizations are looking at how do we incorporate risk assessment, how do we incorporate controls, the standard revenue assurance functions, and kind of establish a wider business focus. So that's what we see going on in the industry. Our strategy right now, this year is the first year that LATRO has as much, if not more, revenue from our revenue assurance portfolio than we do our fraud management portfolio. So interesting times for us. I think what we see going on is you have companies like Verizon, the larger operators, the tier ones, who have progressed down the maturity path over the last 10 years. They have very CapEx heavy tools installed within the organization. They have their processes well defined. They have clear charter, clear vision as an organization. But internationally, there's a lot of smaller operators who have not been able to, for a variety of reasons, keep up with that pace within the tier one market. And so one of our missions in the revenue assurance business is to help these smaller operators, tier two, tier threes, close that gap, right? So we recognize that with shrinking ARPU, with shrinking margins on the operator side, it's really important for them to implement strategies that help them get up the revenue assurance maturity model without dropping millions of dollars in CapEx to get there. So we've been successful already in implementing a managed services model, and I would bet we're using some of the same philosophies and frameworks that you've seen through your career, and really helping these operators recognize and recover significant, like you said, bottom line dollars to the valuation of the company. So that's been our strategy. It's been successful so far. Our goal is to work with operators on a managed services basis to share our history, experience, knowledge in the market to help them shoot for goals like you've seen at Verizon.
I was sitting here getting ready to interrupt you 6 times to get the things that you got to yourself. That was awesome. That was really good. I'm thinking about whether the I was dancing around in my head. It's the pain, the decision to employ, deploy, bring in revenue assurance is based on the pain model. If you're not losing money somewhere that all of a sudden becomes important, you really don't pay attention to it. And it happens usually with the tier ones first, the tier two second, the tier two three, third. But at some point, everybody pays attention to that money because it makes a difference between, with their particular compensation or the company's performance or whatever it might be. All those things become important to everybody eventually.
Yeah, I think Mark Cuban said something to the effect of sales covers over lots of weaknesses or problems or whatever you want to call it in an organization. And eventually you get to the point where you can't continue to meet shareholder and investor expectations solely based on revenue growth, and you have to start looking at how do you improve the bottom line, make sure that you're maximizing the revenue output of whatever network infrastructure you have in place. So yeah, at some point, mobile operators, telecom operators need to implement these kinds of processes and controls.
Yeah, Sarbanes-Oxley was created for a reason, and that's a U.S. thing, but many companies now are looking to that as a standard for compliance with regulatory issues. So,
yeah, so I think it's amazing that there's still this large market for revenue assurance solutions. It's not something new, and like the fraud stories, I think we see a lot of repeated themes and a lot of ongoing work. So that's one of the reasons that LATRO, as you and I know, decided to expand our portfolio to engage more on the revenue insurance side of the business, not just the fraud management side. So we'll continue, of course, to provide our fraud management solutions, but especially with 5G and IoT, I think there's a lot of question marks in the industry about how that's going to affect the role of revenue assurance and fraud management within the organization. 5G, in my opinion, has the potential to be either really simple or really complicated. So this concept of network slicing and providing different levels of service quality and service availability, bandwidth, et cetera, based on kind of the use case of the end device. Like I said, it could be simple, it could be a flat fee kind of model, which maybe revenue assurance is going to be easy. On the other hand, it could be really difficult depending on where the data is coming from, different elements in the network. So I think we're still looking at how that market's going to evolve. IoT is something we've been paying a lot of attention to in the last couple of years. We've been involved in some IoT network specific work. I think we're learning a lot, and it'll be interesting to see how these lessons learned and best practices implemented and developed over the last 10 plus years, 15 years, are carried over to this new IoT space in the market as well.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that content as much as I did. I know Don and Lex would love to hear from you if you have any comments or follow-up questions from what they discussed. You can reach us at www.latro.com, or you can email us directly at info@latroservices.com, and they would love to get in touch with you and answer any questions you might have. Also, we'd love for you to check us out on social media. Feel free to comment. We'd love to hear what you thought about this, and we look forward to doing more content like this in the future. Until next time, see you later.